Welcome, everybody. My name is Bob Truby, and I serve as the director of the Emerging Scholars Network. And I'm so pleased that you took the time to be a part of our call this morning or this afternoon. And we'll be getting started in our conversation with Dan in a few moments here. One of the things I would mention is that during the summer of 2020, we were exposed to sort of competing choruses of shouts in our society. On the one hand, we were hearing people yell, "Defund the police," and on the other, people were yelling, "Blue Lives Matter." Some were angry at a string of incidents of police brutality that left a number of Black citizens dead. Others were standing up for the police and the risks they face on every shift. Our conversation today is about whether these are the only two options or whether there's a better way. Dan Reinhardt believes that police pursue a noble calling, and at the same time that police culture is in desperate need of reform. Now, before we begin, I want to just take care of a couple of housekeeping details. Today's conversation is being recorded. If you prefer not to be recorded, photographed, please leave your mic muted and disable your video. By continuing to participate with your video and audio enabled after the recording begins, you consent to allow InterVarsity to use the recording and any screenshots of our conversation for InterVarsity ministry purpose. I'm going to stop recording for a moment so you can adjust your video and audio settings if you prefer not to be recorded. Our speaker today, our guest today is Dan Reinhardt, who has his PhD from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. He served as a police officer near Cleveland for 24 years. After retiring from the police force, he was an assistant professor at the Heart of Texas Foundation College of Ministry at the Memorial Unit, a prison in Rosharon, Texas. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correct. Currently, he's Associate Director of Student Life and Applied Ministry at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and he lives in Louisville, Kentucky, with his wife, Yvette. So, Dan, welcome to our conversation. So glad you could be here.
Yeah, thankful to be here.
And Dan, thank you for the years of service to your community. We had talked before the conversation about how we both spent time in the Cleveland area. You actually grew up there. And so I value so much what you did there. I wonder if you might just tell us a little bit more about the different assignments that you held while you were serving as a police officer, to give us a little bit of a sense of your experience.
Yeah, I got hired in the mid to late 90s, and I started off as a correction officer in the jail. And I did that for about a year. And then I was hired as a police officer, and I was a patrolman working night shift and afternoon shift for about 3 or 4 years. Then I got put into a community policing unit, which was a 3-man unit in a large government housing complex that was kind of overrun with crime at one point. I did that for 3 years. I went back to the road patrol for a few more years, and then became a school resource officer for 3 years. Somewhere in that time frame, I was on the SWAT team for about 4 or 5 years. I was a field training officer in that time too, training new officers. And then I was promoted to sergeant as when I was in the schools, came out and was the training director for the police department. Then I went to the road again, was promoted to lieutenant. As a lieutenant, I was a shift commander. I worked in internal affairs. I oversaw the jail and the records room. I held a position as the public information officer. I think that's most of it there, but a lot happened in that 24 years.
Sounds like you've done just about everything except head of police department.
Yeah, that I never did.
Yeah, well, it's a breadth of experience that I think really makes you an ideal author for a book like this. Well, the title of your book is Rethinking the Police. Now, some might see that title and wonder if you're among those who have it out for the police and want to defund them. Tell me why you wrote the book.
Well, I wrote the book because, first of all, I love the police. I value the police. My best friends are police officers. Some of the best people I know on this planet Earth, me personally know, are police officers. And what I've seen in my experience is that it's a vast majority of people with good hearts trying to do the right thing in very difficult circumstances. However, as I spent that 24 years in policing, I did see problems with the culture, and even before the culture, in the leadership. And became a Christian about a year into my law enforcement career, and my perspective just in the church, and as the Holy Spirit's cleaning me up and I'm going through that process of sanctification, caused me to really question some of our attitudes, the way we treated people. And so I saw there was a problem. And I saw that problem first in myself and not just on the others. So I knew that by the time I got to my PhD research and I wanted to focus on police leadership and police culture, I understood that change was needed. And it happened to be at a time where you talked about there's these two extremes, like there's nothing wrong with the police, nothing to see here, and then let's just abolish them and get rid of them. And I think neither of those are helpful.
You spent some time studying the history of the police and discovered that that police actually the beginnings of the idea of having community police was actually based on some Christian principles. I wonder if you might tell us about that and about kind of what happened in the course of that history that led to a different kind of culture.
Yeah, the history really gives us insight. The journey of the police history helps us see how the police culture developed. But policing in America started in the big cities, and it was based on the British model. And it was a Christian man, Robert Peel, who very seldom in the literature where you see anybody identify him as a Christian. I had to dig pretty far to find out that that's what he was. But yeah, he reacted to British evangelicals in the British police force. They were unhappy with the way the police dealt with people, thought that it wasn't the right way. So he writes these 9 principles that can be summed up as peacekeeping through the most peaceable means. So he has this focus on peacekeeping, crime prevention, community relations, the oneness of the police with the people. And you can just see, if you look at his 9 principles, and they're in the book, you can just see the Christian, foundation that these principles emerge from. So American police departments, although there's some precursors, the modern police departments in America, starting around in the mid 1800s, base these departments on these principles. But right away, we begin to deviate. One of the reasons is because we're not a national police like Great Britain. We're governed by municipalities. So these police departments are kind of attached to corrupt local politicians. So corruption from the inception in policing starts to kind of seep in. The other thing that the American police were known for, in contrast to the British bobbies, were the tendency towards brutality and heavy force. By the 1920s and 30s, you have prohibition now going on. The police are described as completely corrupt and brutal. And at that point, they bring in reform, and it's what's called, a lot of police historians will call it the professional era of policing. And so they see that the corruption as due to being the police in the community. And so they pull the police away from the community, and instead of focusing on the peacekeeping, that was their primary mission when they started, they begin to focus more on enforcement. They bring in police chiefs, and now they have a very strict hierarchy that we still see today in the police organization. And the police chiefs did a good job of trying to clean up the corruption, wrestling the officers away from the local politicians. But what happened in that era, as we focused on professionalism and crime fighting, is we were distant from the community. We were no longer involved in these the peacekeeping functions, the community relations functions, and we became more what we see today, law enforcement. Well, by the 50s, we're now focused even more just on enforcement, distancing from the community. In America, by the late 50s, you have the racial tensions going on. So you have this police now that have the police as an entity have pulled away from the public. I describe as there's this social distance now between the police and the public. That's most poignant where white officers are policing Black communities, which is the majority at that time of Black communities are going to be policed by all white police departments. So that tension is even greater there. I argue that social distance makes it easier to dehumanize a population, which is going to increase when you have social distance and you have dehumanization and you have power. The history of man teaches us what happens is you're going to see abuse. You're going to see an abuse of that power. And that's why we start to see police brutality. America becomes acquainted with it during the civil rights movement, because now there's cameras and they're videotaping these incidents of the police dealing with, protesters that are wading into masses of people with batons and dogs and fire hoses. So now police brutality isn't some myth, some talked about thing that maybe takes place in urban ghettos and alleys. Now it's in front of people's faces on their television set, namely white America. So that starts a lot of reform into the 70s and the 80s. I'll give you more of an abbreviated version. Then we get into the community policing area kind of in the 80s and 90s. 9/11 happens, and we go, I can give you more details on that, but intelligence-led policing is birthed, which kind of pulls us back more into an enforcement-centric style of policing. But what's remained through that history is this culture of policing that I identify these three trends: social distance, dehumanization, and abuse. And that's instilled in you through the police culture.
I wonder if you might talk a little bit more about police culture and just how that, because it seems like police training oftentimes really emphasizes appropriate uses of force, but police culture really seems to distort that or whatever.
Yeah.
How does that happen?
So I would argue, and I think and others have too, that the police culture is the true teacher in policing. And I just give you my personal experience. So I go to a police academy for 4 months. And in some sense, you're still getting indoctrinated into police thinking because it's taught by cops. You hear all their stories and you begin to get kind of brought into that world. You go back to your police department. They handed me a policy manual that was, I bet you 18 inches thick. And you read through that, and police departments tend to have a policy on everything. So they give you however long it was, you read through that. Then I go into the field training program. What that is I'm going to train with 4 different officers for a month, and you're going to be taught on the job. Well, my first day on the job, when I go in there I am with my policy manual, and I get in the car, and my first field training officer tells me, put that policy manual in the trunk. And now I'm going to show you how we really do things. Forget everything you learned in the police academy. So you come in and you get taught how things work, and you're getting taught at that grassroots level of doing that's been passed on officer to officer for generation after generation after generation.
Yeah. And so you can see how that you got to change that culture. It's the training is not enough.
Well, and I provide lots of examples in the book how they've made external changes and that the internal culture can just basically reverse it, and it doesn't change anything in the end.
Well, you mentioned your conversion and some of the ways you began to rethink your own practice as a policeman and what was happening in the culture of your department. One of the places in the book, you talk about the influence of your pastor. That I think it sounded like was pretty critical to a basic component of the model that you're proposing. You want to tell us a little bit about him?
Yeah, well, just so you know, so I come out of the Army. So my idea of leadership is kind of military leadership, to policing, which all my police sergeants and lieutenants and the captains and chief were all former military like me. So my idea of leadership is kind of like you tell people, you command people, you're in charge, just sort of a heavy autocratic style of leadership. And so I become a Christian, I'm in a church, and I end up in my pastor's small group. And this church started from a storefront church that they built 2 buildings. It's a huge church. To this day, he's discipled other pastors who became senior pastors who have thriving congregations. So this guy, my pastor, is this strong leader. So I sort of imposed on him the qualities that I believe the strong leader had. And then I meet this man, I see him in action, and he's humble and he's caring and he's encouraging. And his dependency and love for the Lord just kind of shattered my paradigm of what a strong leader was. And the more I was around him and the more I saw him interact with people and how he effectively ran the church and built up people, and even when he disciplined people, because he wasn't afraid to tell you when you were wrong. And it was just such a stark difference between him and what I saw in police leadership. And I'm watching this church build people up and grow, and I'm watching my department just kind of go down and down and down, and toxic leadership. And so by seeing that, I thought, well, something's wrong here and something's right here.
Wow. Wow, that's powerful. Hey, so you summarized him as kind of a servant leader, and servant leadership is a key part of your model. I wonder if you might just unpack kind of your model of how rethinking police culture, how that shakes out.
Yeah, servant leadership can kind of be a buzzword, but
Yeah.
it goes back to Robert Greenleaf, and it has a contemporary history. But the criticism of servant leadership is that it is kind of a weak style of leadership, and there's some that's a fair criticism in a lot of ways. So what I do is I take servant leadership and I create a synthesis between, Greenleaf's conception of servant leadership and some of the primary scholars that have written since him, with a specific form of pastoral leadership called Christ-centered followership. And I put those things together through a synthesis in a way that they can be applied in a secular police department, so that there is a Christian foundation in principle and theory, but yet a secular application. And as we know, pastors are shepherds. So as much as they are servants, they are shepherds. They protect the flock, they discipline the flock. So that protective disciplinary function kind of merges with the servant function to oversee officers. So it's a way of building up officers, yet not letting police culture run the show. And we know Christianity by nature is let's call it a philosophy of change, right? Christianity, because it just changes culture, it changes things. So it's infused with that Christian, organic Christian base that's going to change cultures, change people. And so it's just a merger of pastoral leadership with servant leadership, and you can see in the book with very specific applications targeted at the police culture to change the police from the inside out.
Yeah. And then you couple that with community policing and procedural justice. Say a little more about what that looks like.
Well, so if you have community policing and policing now, right? Departments will advertise it, but if you have a culture that is prone to social distance, dehumanization, and abuse, and you currently use the intelligence-led ComStat zero tolerance enforcement strategies, where the police just come into communities and force everything, arrest everybody, right? So you have a culture that's socially distanced, that dehumanizes, and then they have a strategy that just targets people for everything and anything. Am I going to be able to show up the next day and say, hi, I'm Dan, the community police officer, let's build community and relationships and solve some problems? I'm going to come in looking like the enemy. And many communities see the police that way. So what I argue is to bring community policing, which focuses on problem solving, prevention, unity with the community to solve these problems collectively, to get to the underlying issues of crime, to focus on how the procedural justice aspect, on how the community receives the police, the credibility of the police, all these things that are so important that Peel talked about, that you can't police a community that doesn't trust you. So you have to change the police to uphold this new strategy of community policing and procedural justice. Right now, you have a police department, a culture, and current strategies that are antithesis of this. So to really authentically uphold community policing and procedural justice, you need a different type of officer, you need a different type of police department. You need a different relationship between the police department and the community to do this.
You talk in your book about individual examples of police and police leaders who are acting in these kinds of ways. Are there examples of departments who are doing this? Because it sounds like some of the individuals sometimes got grief, and it actually, they got pushback from other officers for trying to police in these sorts of ways. Are there departments that you've seen who are putting these things into practice?
Well, so policing isn't a monolith, obviously, and I'm tapping into the research base that has to do with police culture as it kind of extends across the United States, but there are differences between police departments. And ultimately, my book is talking about police departments in urban contexts.
Mm-hmm.
So that's all I can speak of, I think of, because are there maybe sheriff's departments in more rural areas or affluent areas that are not suffering from these problems? Maybe. And so, but that's not a fair comparison with big city police departments or police departments like the one I worked on that's a larger department, not big city, but faced with high levels of crime and conflict with the community. I have never seen a police department that I would say they represent what a community policing police department should be. Most of the time, even in those communities, the community police officers are separate than the main officers and different.
Mm.
Well, what does that tell you? Then you don't have community policing. In a church, you can't say, well, these are Christians that preach the gospel and live for Jesus Christ, and these are the ones that don't. It would be absurd. You wouldn't have a Christian church. For a police department to have community policing, this would have to be the spirit and heart of every officer and how they apply their job. You can't just have a section. So the short answer is I don't think so. Not authentically. And if you're employing intelligence-led CompStat and zero tolerance, and almost every police department is in some sense, there's no way you have community policing. Because those are, again, it's just the antithesis of community policing. They can't exist authentically together in one place. It'd be like saying you have an Islamic and Christian church.
Huh.
It's impossible. They're conflicting in philosophy, methodology, totally conflicting.
Hey, I got a question here that maybe you can clear up right away because you just mentioned is what's CompStat?
Okay, CompStat was I just give you the Reader's Digest version. It's going to be a meeting where they bring in police leaders and they're going to say, here are these problems. What are you going to do about it? We're going to hold you accountable. Those problems are almost always identified through intelligence-led policing, which is the use of statistics to generate crime maps. It's very maybe simple, oversimplified, but it'll make the point. So here's you're a lieutenant, you're a shift commander. You're going to stand before the captain and the chiefs in this CompStat meeting. They're going to show you this map, and they're going to say, look at these areas of crime that's occurring. What are you going to do about it? Because when you come back next month, we better see a difference. Well, the way that most lieutenants or shift commanders are going to do it is through enforcement. And how are they going to get that quick result? They're going to target that spot with zero tolerance policing. What's zero tolerance policing? It means in that spot, you go in and you enforce everything and anything. And the idea is that if we enforce the small stuff, we'll deter the big stuff and drum up and stir up the waters to catch some of the big stuff. So what's that look like at the practical level? It means I'm going to go into a hot spot, also known as a minority area, where there's more Black and brown people. I'm going to go in there and stop people for jaywalking, littering, no turns, anything I can. I'm going to do stop and frisk or Terry stops on the corner. I'm going to pat people down. I'm going to cite everybody I can with no tolerance. And then it's going to deter crime. What it's going to do is make people hide in their houses. So there probably will be some reduction in crime.
Yeah. And
then I can come back and say, look, chief and captain, we had no homicides in that area. And we wrote 50 tickets and made 25, and we did this and that. And they say, good job, lieutenant. The problem is, as soon as we unoccupy that area, it comes back. And it comes back with people angered because how many people got tickets for no turn signal, littering, things that they know nobody else gets anywhere. And they have nothing to do with the crime in that area. They just happen to live there.
There's also a lot of anger about excessive use of force among police. And how would the change of culture, the reforms that you propose in this book, affect the use of force?
Well, the first thing is the culture, when it begins to support community policing, procedural justice, you're never going to do practices like occupy a neighborhood. Because if you go into a neighborhood and stop everything and enforce everything, and there's already a bad relationship, you're having more encounters, more contentious encounters, which are going to lead to more incidents of resisting arrest. And when you have that combination going on with a police culture that says social distance and dehumanization, you're going to have abuse. You're going to have police brutality. So when you change the culture to, and I argue for a new ethic in policing too, which I won't get into right now, but when you change the culture where it values people, values relationships, sees yourself as a follower first of the people, as a servant of the people, then you come in with a new posture. You're coming in with a new strategy. That's going to lower contentious encounters. That's going to build over time trust and legitimacy in the eyes of the people for the police. And that's going to lead to more judicious applications of force and less opportunities, less situations, and better attitudes, so that police brutality and use of force is going to come down. Robert Peel argued that how you reduce police force is through police legitimacy. The more legitimate you are, the more people trust you, the more likely they are to do what you ask them to do.
Yeah. And he did a lot of that originally with the London Metropolitan Police, who didn't have a lot of the armament, as it were, that modern police have.
Yeah.
You know, so they had to use a lot of other means to deal with crime.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to take a break here, and I've already put in the chat the information about how you can get Dan's book at a discount. I'm going to just put that up on the screen here so you can see it. So the book that we've been talking about today is Rethinking the Police, and it's available at InterVarsity Press. And we've provided a discount code, IVP-ESN25, that's good until November 23rd to get a 25% discount on the book with free shipping. So if you want to, and that all that information, the link, the code are in the chat. And if you think what Dan's talking about sounds pretty interesting, you might want to pick up a copy. Okay, we're going to get back into audience Q&A, and let me see if we have any questions already in the chat. If not, we would love to get some questions from you all. We've already talked about what CompStat is, so and Tim comments that CompStat was well represented in the HBO show The Wire. So those of you who caught that series might have a little bit of an idea about that. While we're waiting on that, Dan, one of the things I wanted to ask you about is, it strikes me that day-to-day policing work can be pretty demanding. You see the underside of humanity a lot of times. Who cares for the police? Because I could just see a combination of hardness and almost PTSD type things happening to police. Who cares for the police?
Well, I can speak from my vocational context, and you're right. You see things that just normal people shouldn't see at a rate that can be very damaging. But there's always employee assistance programs and programs like that. But I think the police culture really, frowns on anybody doing that and going to seek help. We had a couple suicides in the time that I was there. I saw guys go out for long periods on stress and medications and all these things. But the only time I ever saw like the preventative measures used is when somebody was maybe facing being fired, and they were just using it, as a vehicle to keep their job. So although there is, I suppose, help out there, as policemen, you're kind of siloed and you just stay in that little group. For 24 years, I never spoke about anything that happened at work to my wife. Even the stories that are in the book, until she reads the book, she's never heard them. So you kind of develop just habits of keeping it all to yourself, and everybody that you know and that you work with every day sees the same thing. And so I don't think there's probably effective things there to help police officers. And part of that is self-induced, but It's just the nature of it, I suppose.
Tim asked the question, can you speak about slave patrols as one of the historical precedents for policing in the U.S.?
Yeah, so I pick up with contemporary modern policing and don't go into the precursors to the modern police department. But part of my argument is that there's systemic racism in policing through the current strategy, and the slave patrols in the history before modern policing even informs that more. But I mean, it's an accurate statement that slave patrols were precursors to modern policing.
Hey, Chris asks, almost all police where I live in affluent San Clemente carry guns. Do you advocate that fewer police should be armed with lethal weapons?
If that sounds like, they don't really need the gun, because chances are nothing will happen, and that's a good thing. But what if it does? What's he going to do? If you happen to be the guy that's getting robbed and someone's going to take your life, and he shows up and goes, sorry, I'm one of the guys they didn't equip with a gun, now let's call somebody else. That's going to be a bad practice. So there's always the potential that a gun is needed in a nation where people can carry guns, have access to guns, and have been shown to use guns. So if you send the police out without guns, maybe they'll be okay. But if that situation arises, they can't react to it. What if there's a school shooting? Those happen in affluent communities. What's he going to do?
That's what I was thinking about in the instances of police officers who, everybody else is running away and they run to it if they're doing their job.
I didn't use my gun much as a police officer, and even in the most violent cities, you can say that. But the times you do have to use it, I wouldn't be here if I didn't have it.
Kate asked the question, is the culture you're talking about found in other countries' police forces?
So I stick strictly with the American police. And I'm sure there's some crossover, but it's the racial frameworks of how we see identity in America that helps build the police culture, the tension between races in the United States that informs the culture. So I'm sure there's some parity, but what I focus on is the police culture in America. And there's a lot of it has to do with how we identify in the United States, where we focus more on our racial identity, maybe more so than our national identity. For instance, in Brazil, before somebody would identify as being black or white, they would say they're Brazilian. We in America are going to say we're white, black, Hispanic, whatever. So that racial emphasis and social identity, I think, had a lot to do with building the police culture in America.
Kate, who asked that question, clarified. She was wondering if there's a good police force in other countries that could be a model for our police forces here.
Well, again, it's not that we don't have the right strategies. It's that there's a culture driving those strategies. And so you could bring in a model, you can make external changes, but if the internal doesn't align with the external, it'll never get applied authentically. You'll get nominal compliance. So it's the internal culture, the internal leadership that has to change to move forward any change external. You would just bring in external that really would never get done.
Yeah, it often sounds like a lot of window dressing to me.
Yeah, it's, just like you could say, well, we have right now, there's scholars who will say we're in the community policing era. That's comical to me.
Yeah. One of the questions here, let me see who asked that. John asked the question of, are there established ways for families who are victims of police violence, fatal or not, to talk directly with police departments about specific cases without going through lawyers? Or does it just, let me, just a second here. Without going through lawyers, does it just depend on the size, culture of the department? So are there any ways that families can engage with the police about instances of violence?
Well, so it's going to be very difficult to get a police department to make any admission of guilt. Because if they do, then they're liable in court. And if they do, they're going to point specifically to an officer and implement progressive discipline. So if you have an officer, let's use Officer Chauvin in the George Floyd case. He's going to be fired, prosecuted, and put out. If he's not identified as committing police brutality and the family feels that he did or she did, they're not going to admit that that's police brutality. So you could never come to the table on fair terms. However, I would say the restorative justice movement, if it can build get more tracking and more ground, and that would lead to police officers and police departments kind of being impelled to speak to the community about incidents of violence and have more open conversation. But if you're talking about where they're going to come up and say, hey, we're really sorry that our officer did this to you. Well, the way they're going to say that is if the officer's been found, guilty of police brutality, they're going to fire him and prosecute him. If he hasn't, then they're going to admit to no wrongdoing. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay, do you discuss restorative justice in your book? And can you say more?
No, I wish that I could have, because I think it has my model of policing, I think, could be the application of restorative justice and the whole criminal justice movement in policing. But there wasn't the space, or I would have had to write a whole nother book essentially. So no, I don't.
There are problems sometimes. You have limits with your publisher of how much you can do. Let's see. We're getting a lot of great questions here. So let me go back here. Having a little bit of trouble actually looking at all of these. A follow-up question to John's question is it common to discipline for discipline of individual officers to happen behind the scenes and not be documented in public records out of fear of legal or professional consequences?
Yeah, so I can tell you that went on at my police department until we were part of a Department of Justice investigation in 2007. So a lot of it would have been done kind of behind. Don't do that. Avoid that. And then after that, once we were part of that DOJ investigation, everything kind of went above board in policies. And so there may be some police departments that still do that, but we didn't. Any discipline was documented. There was progressive discipline. It was all done above board.
And one of the questions I wanted to ask as well was, so much of what you've talked about with your model of community policing is shifting from a focus on arrest to working with the community to prevent crime, as I understand it. And you give a number of examples of police spending time with youth, coaching wrestling and other things, being involved with the community in other ways, and sitting down with them to talk together about what their concerns are around crime and how you can work together on that. Now, I can imagine some people protesting that police just don't have the bandwidth to do this, that they're not social workers. How do you respond to that?
Well, I would just say, how's the current model going?
Okay.
And give examples of how, we're always getting more money for enforcement. What's it doing? I'm not for defunding the police. I think we need to expand the police, but then focus them in on different things. As a school resource officer, just to give you an example, because I played ping pong with kids. I coached wrestling. I'd roll down they knew me as Dan, not just Officer Dan. And these kids, I left the school, I would come up on a scene, and like school resource officers other than me definitely would be able to testify to this. They would be ready to fight it out with the police. They're not giving up. And I'd walk up and say the guy's name, say, what are you doing? And that'd be the end of it. They'd come out because relationship. So you have enough officers where you can begin to build relationships with your community. And maybe not everybody, but I know so many times, because of the way I impacted people before a violent incident, when I showed up, there wasn't going to be a violent incident
Hmm.
because there was trust. And what if every officer invested into people that way? Or we can write more tickets and see if we can win this war on drugs and enforce our way out of this problem. But it doesn't seem to be working. And I think the biggest sign of that was George Floyd. When a community decides, we're just not going to do what you say anymore. There's not much we can do about it. So unless you build relationships and get the community behind you, and we all collectively decide, hey, we have a vested interest in bringing peace to our communities, then there won't be change. And that's a long-term investment. That's a different way to frame the police relationship. But I reject any idea that, well, they don't have time for that. Well, they could just maybe use their time differently, and over time it would change things.
Dan, I wonder, what are you doing beyond having written this book to see this kind of policing implemented and trying to change this culture?
That's a good question. So I just real quick on my story. I went back to school at 36 years old. I didn't have a college education because I got out of the military, had to take care of my family, took a job as a policeman, became a Christian. And I went to college at Moody Bible Institute just for the purposes of discipleship, but I felt the Lord was leading me. Then I found out there was something called a seminary. And so I went to seminary and got my Master of Divinity. Then I knew there was doctoral work. And this time I thought, well, maybe I could do some doctoral work that related to both fields. And I came to Southern and wrote this dissertation. Retired in 2021 when I finished my PhD, thinking I would either teach or pastor. And now I find myself writing a book, writing academic articles in policing. And I just felt that the way I could, to answer your question, the way I could change things would be to teach young officers coming up something new, something different. And so I went back starting this summer to finish my master's in criminal justice. I'll be done in the spring, and I'm hoping to teach criminal justice courses and maybe even turn my book into a leadership book to teach criminal justice professionals of the future to come in with a different mindset, to come in prepared for the culture they're going to see, and come in as change agents.
Yeah. It occurs to me we ought to be a service to send this book to every police chief in the country.
So my police, my good friend, who's a Christian, who's a captain, my wonderful Christian man, read my PhD dissertation. That's how you want to know if you got a good friend, if he sits down and reads your PhD dissertation.
You betcha.
Which is basically a lot of the book comes from that. And I called him and asked him what he thought, and he said, "I'm angry at you right now. I don't want to talk about it." And like a couple weeks later, we talked, and he said, "This was hard to hear, and but I think you're right. But this is tough." And that's a very gracious response. Most police officers that I've talked to about what I think just categorically reject what I say. And by the way, I have so much love for them, because if you handed me my book 10 years ago and said, this is written by somebody else, I would have said, man, this guy's nuts. I wouldn't have been able to receive it either.
Yeah. Yeah, but you raise a good question. How's the current model working?
Yeah. And of course I relate that the police leadership builds the culture, reinforces the culture.
Yeah.
And then leads to these tendencies. So the officers are being framed by this toxic, oppressive leadership that basically makes them toxic, oppressive officers. And they don't see that because they think it's normal, just like I did.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, one of the things in your book you talked about was engaging Black youth and their identity formation, and that how important for police in the community it is to be having that kind of those kind of relationships and that kind of impact. Well,
Yeah.
Go
Are you
ahead.
asking me why I think that's important?
Yeah.
So I'm a wrestling coach, right? So if you took or was. If you took over a high school wrestling program, you said, I want to build a good high school wrestling program, I'd say start with your 5-year-old biddy program, because you got to start early and you got to reshape it. Well, the problem's coming with, where's the violence and the real, the brutality and the contentious encounters happening? What's happening between young Black males and police officers? So let's invest in young, teenage age African American youth, build different relationships with them. We'll never be able to put a stat on it, but how many will you impact there that now when they're 25, there's a completely different interaction? Much like the wrestling program, you can't put a stat on it, but it's the investment you made in these young kids that will produce the program that's successful. It's the investment you make in this young generation that will change the context and the contentious encounters in the future. But it's a long-term strategy.
Yeah.
You can't sell that in a CompStat meeting where they're asking for immediate results to a problem that's been built over 100 years.
Well, and Paul made the observation in the chat that that culture change is a long-term process. And I think your book is certainly one step in articulating sort of a vision for that process and what that might look like, and which is hugely valuable. Hey, I want to give you the last word, and then we're going to take one more shot at letting people know how to get the book. But kind of give us your last, parting shot.
So the hope for policing. I wrote this book not for police officers, but for people who are concerned, specifically thoughtful Christians who are concerned about what's going on. In order to change the police, enough people on the outside need to know the inside problem so that they can push for external pressure to make internal change. So read the book, and I know it sounds self-serving. Get the book for other people. I want to inform the community at large on how we change policing so that external pressure won't just end up in window dressing. It'll actually target the heart of the problem and bring internal change.
Yeah, great word. Well, I hope people will do that, and we're just going to, one more time, we're going to let them know how that happens. You can get Dan's book on Rethinking the Police through InterVarsity Press using the code IVP ESN 25. And that code will be available until November 23rd. Again, here's the book that we've been talking about, and great cover. And so I'd encourage you to pick that up, and maybe pick it up and get a group of people together who, if you've been concerned in your community about policing, maybe this would be a great step in thinking through how you want to begin to engage and approach that as a community person. Want to tell you about our next conversation. We have the Christmas holidays coming up, and our guest in the next conversation is going to be Emily Hunter McGowan, who has published a new book called Christmas, and it's part of the Fullness of Time series, a series of books that InterVarsity Press has published, taking us through the church year. And she talks about how at the first Christmas, God exchanged the glories of divinity for the vulnerability of human existence, uniting himself to us in order to unite us to God. In this short volume, part of the Fullness of Time series, she invites us into the church's celebration of that great exchange in all its theological and liturgical splendor. And the book, the registration link is in the chat, as well as the date of the time, December 12th, 2023 at 1 p.m. Eastern time. And we will offer a discount for that book, but we're also going to do something else. We're inviting any of you who are involved with this, and we'll put this out in our emails too, who would consider a contribution at year's end to the Emerging Scholars Network of $50 or more. We'll send you the book for free, so that you can use that in your reflections over the Christmas holidays, or give it as a gift to somebody else. And so we've put the link to how you might give to the Emerging Scholars Network account, and we would be very grateful. Our programming costs are about $10,000 a year, and we would greatly appreciate your help. If you, we want to make these things available for free, but if you would like to contribute to that, we would be very grateful. With that, we want to just wrap it up here and say thank you so much for joining us today. This program was brought to you by the Emerging Scholars Network. You can join for free at blog.emergingscholars.org. Just click on the join button. We're on social media on Facebook, Instagram, and X as it is now at ESN IVCF. Also, this video and about over 50 others are on our YouTube channel, and that's youtube.com/ESNIVCF. So with that, I want to thank you for joining us. Dan, thanks so much for being a part of our conversation. And I'd like to acknowledge and thank University Press for its assistance in setting up these conversations. So with that, we're going to conclude our recording. And if anybody wants to stay on for just a minute or so afterwards, you're welcome to.